The studio lights were bright. Too bright. The kind that made every bead of sweat look like an admission of guilt. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, sat calmly under the glare, blonde hair impeccably styled, her tailored crimson blazer screaming, prepared for war. But even she didn't expect what was coming. The anchor across from her adjusted his glasses with theatrical flair. Nathan Greeley, liberal journalist, viral provocateur, darling of the progressive Twitter crowd, was known for ambushing his guests with a smirk and a trap. Tonight, she was his target. "Welcome to Point of No Return, Pam," Nathan said, his tone drenched in that passive-aggressive charm. "It's not every day we get someone with your resume." Pam's lips curled into a polite smile. "Glad to be here, Nathan. I'm sure we'll have a lively chat." "Oh, I don't doubt that," he replied with a chuckle. Then, as if flipping a switch, his eyes sharpened. "So, let's not waste time. You were Florida's AG during one of the most politically divisive times in modern memory. But what a lot of people remember most is your appearance at the Republican National Convention, defending Trump like a trial lawyer on Red Bull. How's that going for you now that he's buried under indictments?" Pam leaned forward slightly, unbothered. "You mean the same indictments that, despite months of headlines and legal gymnastics, haven't landed a conviction?" "I'd say it's going just fine." Nathan grinned. "Spoken like a true loyalist. But let's talk about corruption. Tonight's theme. You've made a career railing against it. Meanwhile, your critics say you were handed a cushy job on Trump's legal team after declining to investigate Trump University in Florida. Coincidence?" The audience behind the glass fell still. Cameras zoomed in. Pam didn't blink. "I was offered that job years later, and the Trump University settlement was in the interest of Floridians. We got them refunds. You want to spin it into a conspiracy? Go ahead. But check the court record first." Nathan pivoted like a cat sensing weakness. "Let's talk about money. Corporate money. Super PACs. Dark money. You've raised millions. Ever worry it undermines the trust people have in democracy?" Pam smiled, sharp as a blade. "I worry more about journalists who pretend to be watchdogs while being lapdogs for their preferred narrative. You're upset about dark money? Let's talk about Act Blue's funneling strategies. Or are we only against corporate influence when it's not funding your side?" Nathan blinked once. Just once. She continued. "You want to talk corruption, Nathan? Great. Let's talk about insider stock trading in Congress, on both sides. About Hunter Biden's art suddenly becoming worth $500,000, no gallery history. About lobbyists writing climate policy while owning oil futures. I'll stay here all night if you want to discuss hypocrisy." He tried to interrupt, but she raised a hand. "Oh, and before you say, whataboutism, let me remind you, pointing out selective outrage isn't deflection, it's drawing a pattern." Nathan leaned back. His smirk faltered, then returned, forced. "Okay. You've got your talking points, I'll give you that." "No talking points. Just facts. Maybe you're not used to guests who don't flinch when you go for the kill." The audience laughed. Not with him. Nathan shifted in his seat, going for one last hit. "Do you think Americans trust people like you anymore? People in politics who switch sides the second it benefits them?" Pam's eyes gleamed now. "I think Americans trust someone who can take hard questions and answer with substance. Not someone who dances behind sarcasm and a 7-minute segment. You invited me here to roast me, but I came here to clarify something." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "That the real corruption isn't just in campaign donations or backroom deals. It's in the erosion of real conversation. In media. In politics. In people pretending to ask tough questions while pushing pre-written narratives. And tonight, you proved my point better than I ever could." And with that, she leaned back, calm, collected. Nathan stared for a beat too long. No comeback. The pause in the studio was subtle, but palpable. Nathan Greeley adjusted the notes on his desk, pages now visibly bent at the corners. Pam Bondi sat unmoved, legs crossed, chin slightly raised. She had landed a counterpunch, and everyone knew it. But Nathan wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. "Let's go deeper," he said, voice lower now, the edge returning. Since we're being candid, Pam, let's talk about January 6th. Pam's expression didn't change, but her hands clasped slightly tighter in her lap. You were a prominent voice in the weeks leading up to the certification, Nathan continued. Some would say you helped normalize the idea that the election was stolen. Do you take any responsibility for what happened at the Capitol that day? Pam didn't flinch. She turned toward him slowly, voice steady as polished marble. I take responsibility for defending due process. I never called for violence. I never supported it. But questioning the integrity of an election isn't a crime, Nathan, it's a constitutional right. Or is that a right now reserved only for Democrats after their losses? Nathan smirked. Cute pivot. No pivot, she said. Let's rewind to 2016. How many elected Democrats boycotted Trump's inauguration? How many peddled the Russia hoax for years, despite a complete lack of criminal evidence? You want to talk about undermining democracy? Let's talk about setting that precedent. Nathan looked down at his notes, momentarily thrown off. You're comparing the Mueller investigation to an attempted insurrection, he said finally, tone clipped. I'm comparing how both sides justify tearing down institutions when they lose, Pam shot back. What happened on January 6th was wrong. Full stop. But it doesn't erase the years of political gaslighting that came before it. The only difference is, your side had CNN on speed dial. There was a low cough from someone behind the camera. Nathan's jaw tightened. You're clearly good at muddying the waters, Pam. But I'm asking a simple question. Do you regret saying the election was unfair? Pam leaned in slightly. I regret that the media refused to ask questions at all. You called us conspiracy theorists for wanting audits, then later admitted there were irregularities in several states. We weren't afraid of the answer, we were afraid of not being allowed to ask the question. The temperature in the studio dropped. Nathan sensed the shift and tried another route. Okay. Let's leave 2020 behind for a second. You've made millions since leaving office. You're a Fox News contributor, a corporate board advisor, private legal counsel for high-profile Republicans. Is public service just a launchpad to cash in? Pam's smile returned. You're a political commentator with a book deal, a podcast, and 5 sponsorships in your Instagram bio. Spare me the outrage over monetizing a career. A muffled laugh escaped someone behind a camera. Nathan straightened in his chair. Difference is, I'm not pretending to serve the public. That's exactly the problem, she replied, eyes locked on his. You think public service disqualifies you from having a life afterward. Meanwhile, your colleagues make millions on political theater and still call themselves journalists. Nathan opened his mouth, but Pam raised her hand. Let me ask you something, Nathan, she said, flipping the script. When's the last time you did a segment on lobbyist influence in the Biden administration? Or government contracts funneled to family-linked firms? You claim to fight corruption, but somehow it's always red, never blue. Nathan scowled. We investigate both sides. No, Pam cut in. You perform balance. Like when you spent 15 minutes condemning Trump's tax returns, then spent 5 seconds shrugging at Hunter Biden's emails. You want accountability? Start by holding a mirror. The silence in the studio grew heavier. Nathan looked at his papers again, flipping a page that suddenly seemed irrelevant. The talking points had lost their rhythm. Pam continued, voice cool. You invited me here expecting a fight, Nathan. But you weren't ready for a conversation. That's the problem with media now. You don't want dialogue. You want confessions. She leaned back again. But I don't play for either of your teams. I play for facts. And they're not on your side tonight. Nathan Greeley wasn't sweating, but he was close. His collar was tighter. His tone, clipped. On paper, this was supposed to be an easy play. Get Pam Bondi to squirm, clip the segment, let Twitter do the rest. But instead, he was bleeding credibility on live television. Still, he wasn't done. Let's take a detour, Nathan said, flipping to a new page in his notes with exaggerated flair. Back in 2013, your office declined to join a lawsuit against the opioid manufacturers. 4 months later, Your campaign accepted a $25,000 donation from a PAC linked to one of those companies. That's a fact. Care to explain that one? He said it like a dagger, like it would be the moment her defenses cracked. Pam didn't flinch. She took a slow breath, then looked him dead in the eye. You're right. We didn't join that particular suit. Not because of donations, but because we filed our own. A stronger one. With more tailored charges. We recovered over $870 million for Florida. Look it up. Nathan blinked. He had clearly expected her to deflect, not detonate. In fact, she continued, voice now edged with a calm fury, Florida ended up getting more than most states that joined the federal suit. You're calling it corruption, but the only thing corrupt here is the narrative you're trying to force down people's throats. Nathan shuffled his notes, trying to recover. But the timing, don't you think it looks bad? Oh, we're doing optics now, Pam said, tilting her head. Where was your segment about Kamala Harris not prosecuting Steve Mnuchin's bank after receiving a campaign donation? Where's the special episode on Nancy Pelosi's impeccable stock market timing? You want to talk about optics? Start in your own backyard. The studio air felt thick. Pam didn't wait for permission. See, this is what people hate about politics, and journalism, frankly. The hypocrisy. You cry about corruption, but only when it fits your side's narrative. You want to paint me as a villain? Fine. But let's not pretend you're wearing a white hat, Nathan. Nathan gritted his teeth, sensing the moment slipping. He tried to interrupt, but Pam steamrolled forward. You've made a career poking at conservatives. Got your podcast. Your book deal. Your progressive awards. She made air quotes with her fingers. But when it comes to real questions, about Chinese investment in Silicon Valley, about Big Pharma's ties to both parties, you go conveniently quiet. Why is that? I don't answer to politicians, he snapped. I answer to the people. Oh, please, she said, waving her hand. You answer to engagement metrics. You're not here for truth. You're here for clicks, for retweets. You invite people like me not to challenge ideas, but to try and score points. But guess what? This isn't a debate team. This is the real world. Nathan swallowed hard. And then she hit him with it. You want to talk about corruption? Let's talk about that research paper you co-authored back in college. The one that used fabricated polling data from an unnamed source that later turned out to be your roommate. The color drained from Nathan's face. That was retracted years ago. I've addressed that. Pam raised a brow. Oh, so context matters now? Funny how that works. A producer behind the glass put her hand over her mouth. Someone else looked at the control board and mouthed, "What the hell?" You built your brand on calling out the system, she continued. But you've got skeletons too. The difference is, I didn't come here to bury you with them. But since you brought shovels. Nathan fumbled. We're going to take a quick break, he stammered, his voice suddenly small. No, don't, Pam said, turning directly to the camera. This is what they do. They turn off the lights when the conversation gets real. But Americans aren't stupid. They can see through spin. They know real answers when they hear them. And tonight, they heard them. The camera feed cut, just a second too late to stop the damage. The seconds after Pam Bondi's final line felt like hours. Nathan Greeley sat across from her, utterly still, his right hand hovering above a blank section of his notes as if he had forgotten what a pen was. The studio was dead silent. No one behind the cameras moved. The crew, usually buzzing with light signals, whispered cues, and headsets chirping with time transitions, stood as frozen as he was. Pam didn't gloat. She didn't lean back with a smirk or cross her arms triumphantly. She simply watched him, composed, as if still waiting for a real question that had never come. Nathan's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He blinked, not once but twice, as if trying to reset a malfunctioning screen in his brain. Ms. Bondi, he finally said, voice lower now, far more uncertain than it had been when the cameras started rolling, I think we've covered enough for tonight. He avoided eye contact when he said it. Pam gave a simple nod, like a teacher who knew a student had finally reached the limit of his own argument. "If you think so," she said, and her voice carried no sarcasm. Just a trace of finality. Nathan reached for his coffee, his hand trembling slightly, and took a sip only to realize the cup was empty. The hollow sound of porcelain meeting his lip filled the studio like a whisper of embarrassment. He set it back down too quickly. The cup clinked loudly, and he winced. We'll end the segment there," he said, turning slightly toward the nearest camera, but with none of the closing panache he was known for. "Thank you for joining us. We'll be back after the break." The red on-air light clicked off with a soft pop, and the silence that followed was deafening. Pam stood slowly. She didn't rush. She straightened her blazer with a graceful tug, gathered her folder from the table, and nodded once to the room, professional, unshaken. Nathan still hadn't stood. As she turned and walked past the cameras, one of the crew, a young man in his 20s, stepped aside with a polite gesture to let her pass. She gave him a kind, almost imperceptible smile. Then she was gone. The moment the studio door clicked shut behind her, the quiet collapsed like a lung that had been holding its breath too long. Nathan remained in his chair, now staring at the notes in front of him like they were written in a language he had never seen before. He turned one page, then another, each movement slower than the last. A few pages slid off the edge of the desk and floated to the floor. He didn't bother picking them up. Behind the glass in the control room, two producers exchanged glances but said nothing. One of them whispered, "Leave him." So they did. The lights dimmed overhead. The boom mic was slowly raised. The floor director gave a quiet, practiced signal to the crew to power down the set. And Nathan Greeley sat there alone. The room, now darker, seemed to shrink around him. The desk felt larger than before, more like a courtroom bench than a broadcast table. He ran a hand over his mouth and jaw, then leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fingers laced together. He had spent his career painting himself as the righteous challenger, the man who cornered politicians with a smirk and a scalpel. But tonight he had been the one cornered. And he had no exit. What shook him most wasn't that she had won the argument. It was that she hadn't needed to raise her voice to do it. She hadn't insulted him. She hadn't dodged a single question. She simply walked through the fire he'd built for her, one step at a time, and left him standing in the ashes. His questions had sounded so clever in rehearsal. They sounded like accusations now. He slowly stood, legs stiff. He looked around the studio like he was seeing it for the first time. The wires, the unused lights, the abandoned camera dollies, all the props of control, suddenly meaningless. He picked up one sheet of paper from the floor, his big closing question, now smudged from where his boot had stepped on it. It read, "Final blow. Ask if she feels complicit in rising distrust of democracy." He stared at the sentence. Then, without ceremony, crumpled the page and dropped it into the trash can beside the desk. It hit the bottom with a hollow thunk. He looked at the desk again. Then the cameras. Then he walked out, slowly, head down, without a word. No handlers. No follow-up. No salvaging spin. Just silence. And the knowledge that somewhere out in the hallway, a woman in a red blazer had walked out with her dignity intact. And he hadn't.